Okay, everybody, we're going to start now. So again, welcome. I'm Asya Geisberg from Asya Geisberg Gallery. Thank you for joining us today for this wonderful conversation between Gina Buenfeld-Murley, exhibitions curator at the Camden Art Centre and organizer of The Botanical Mind, Art, Mysticism, and the Cosmic Tree, and our gallery artist, Angelina Gualdoni. We are so thrilled to be able to use this format to connect our speakers as Gina is currently across the pond in England. Angelina will speak with Gina on the synergy between the mysteries of herbalism, alchemy, the historical uses of plants, and the elusive painting process. And now to introduce our speakers, Gina Buenfeld-Murley is exhibitions curator at Camden Art Centre, London, where she has co-curated The Botanical Mind, Art, Mysticism, and the Cosmic Tree in 2020, A Tale of Mother's Bones, Grace Palethorpe, Ruben Mednikoff, and the Birth of Psychorealism, and solo exhibitions with Athanasios Argianis, Wang Ping, Yuko Mori, Joaquim Kester, João Maria Guzmão, and Pedro Paiva, Bonnie Camplin, and Rose English. Recent independent curatorial projects include GA, Holistic Science and Wisdom Tradition at Newland Art Gallery and the Exchange Cornwall, and Origin Story at the Waino Aaltonen Museum of Art, Turku, Finland. In 2017, she was curatorial resident at Helsinki International Curatorial Program, Finland, and has been researching the place of plants within the indigenous cultures in Europe and South America, including in the Colombian, Peruvian, and Brazilian areas of the Amazon rainforest. In 2014-2015, she was curator in residence with Arts Initiative Tokyo and established Tokyo Correspondence, a series of exhibitions, residencies, and research visits, facilitating cultural dialogue between artists in the UK and Japan, and curated at the Still Point of the Turning World at Shibaru House, Tokyo. She was previously director at Alison Jacks Gallery, London. Angelina Gualdoni received her BFA from the Maryland Institute College of Art in Baltimore and her MFA from the University of Illinois in Chicago. Her paintings have been the subject of solo and group shows nationally and internationally at the Crystal Flowers Art Salon, New York, the Nerman Museum of Contemporary Art, Kansas City, Tufts University Galleries, Boston, St. Louis Arts Museum, Queens Museum, the Museum of Contemporary Art, Chicago, the Aldrich Museum, the Museum de Paviljoens, the Neuberger Museum. Her work resides in the Saatchi Collection, as well as the MCA Chicago and the Nerman Museum, Kansas City. She has been the beneficiary of several grants and fellowships, including New York Foundation for the Arts, the Daynard Faculty Research Award, Artadia, the Pollock-Krasner, and has attended residencies at Carrizozo AIR, MacDowell Colony, Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture, the International Studio and Curatorial Program, and Chateau La Napoule. Angelina Gualdoni lives and works in New York. If audience members have any questions, please write them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we will answer them at the end of the discussion. We would appreciate it if you keep yourselves muted. Thank you. And now, please welcome Angelina Gualdoni and Gina Buenfeld-Murley.
So thank you so much, Asya and Angelina, for this invitation to have this conversation today. And hello, everyone. Good afternoon and greetings from London. So I'm really delighted to be joining you today to have this conversation because Angelina and I have so many shared interests. I think we're going to have a really interesting conversation touching on herbalism, alchemy, the power of images. And one of the ideas that really sort of inspired me in your thinking, Angelina, was about hidden knowledge and these forms of knowledge which are perhaps occluded from the mainstream. And for me, that really resonated because one of the most important forms of knowledge, which I think are important in terms of what we're going to speak about, is the knowledge that comes directly from plants themselves. So we're talking in the context of your wonderful exhibition, which is no longer on, but we'll see plenty of images, the Physic Garden. And I think, you know, the images that you've created really speak to this sort of intelligibility in nature, and a kind of spirit and force that comes through in the natural world. And the exhibition that you mentioned, Assia, in your introduction, the Botanical Mind, Art, Mysticism and the Cosmic Tree, that I co-curated with Martin Clark at Camden Art Centre, really emerged out of an encounter with plants. And, you know, I was sort of compelled by the plant itself to inquire into what its form meant, what its inner being really was. And I think that really resonates through your work for me. And we're both people that have a love of not only the plant kingdom, but the fungal kingdom. And I know that you're an enthusiastic forager. So I think just to start the presentation, is that working for everybody? Yep. I'd like to start, Angelina, with this amazing painting. This is one of the images that really sort of moved me from your exhibition, because it spoke to so many of my thoughts and understandings about the plant kingdom. Notably that, you know, plants have this kind of strange function really that we often overlook, where they're performing a kind of alchemy which allows the rest of life on this planet to exist. And I really felt that that came through in this painting. So you see these sort of silhouetted forms of the plants reaching up into the celestial realm, and they're in this kind of nightscape which evokes the sort of that silvery light of the moon. And then beneath it, with a sort of different vanishing point, you've got this underground kind of sarcophagus, which shows the underground world of plants, which we often don't necessarily think about. And this really spoke to me about the relationship of plants to, as I say, the celestial, the immaterial, and the alchemy that they perform when they transmute this energy from the sun into the matter that surrounds us, into this material existence that we live through. So we eat plants, they produce the atmosphere that we breathe. There would be no animal life on this planet without them. And I'll come back to this painting in a second, but it really resonated for me with this image, which is a very mysterious alchemical image, which conveys, again, a similar sort of reflection on this sort of upper world of the celestial and this underworld. So here we're seeing Apollo surrounded by the 6 muses, which represent the metals. But I just wondered if you could say something, first of all, about where you started with this image, and yeah, just your thoughts about it.
Sure. Well, you definitely described accurately a lot of what I was thinking about it. And what I love about you positing hidden knowledge as something that courses through, I think, a lot of our interests is that this idea of hidden knowledge is pretty common, actually, not only to alchemy, to herbalism being the kind of aligned with a lot of folk medicine and kind of passed from person to person. So you would have to know someone to kind of gain entry into this world for a long time, but also being kind of in the world of painters' secrets of all of the different types of tricks that you can do with paint and different additives. And so that idea of hidden knowledge definitely courses through a lot of my work. As does this idea of uniting kind of physical and psycho-spiritual aspects of healing and well-being. That's what alchemy and herbalism try to do. And painting has this potential to hold multiple worlds at the same time too, to be a physical object, to be a descriptive object, to be a symbolic object, kind of all at once. And so this painting came really from thinking about the transformative potential of what happens during compost you know, where you take things that decay or you bury things and they start to break down into the soil, and all of their minerals are kind of redispersed and go to feed the plant life that we see above ground. So there's all of this regenerative capacity that's being built under our feet that we have no real way of, we don't think about a whole lot, I think, because we don't see it. It's invisible to us. And yet it is so crucial to the health and well-being, not only of humans, but of our ecosystem as a whole. And so the multiplicity part here comes through kind of the play with perspective. Like, this can be read as a cross section where I'm looking at a vitrine or a vessel that's been buried underground. Or you could kind of read it through this twisted medieval perspective where it's a kind of very steep incline looking up a hill, in which it would be a kind of compost or like a dump, you know, that plants are kind of resting and falling into before decomposing. And in the above section, they don't really mirror each other, perhaps. They almost are each other's complements. And so the flowers, I always thought, were kind of skeletal and bone-like, and definitely like aligned with the moon, like rather lunar, but almost more like the ghost pipe that you'll see in forests sometimes, that receives all of its nutrients off of the mycelial network, but actually doesn't synthesize with chloroform, you know, so it is dependent upon this underground hidden network.
It's fascinating. And this idea of the underground being a kind of site of decomposition is a really interesting one, because it's also the place that life then springs forth from. So
Yes.
it's this place of regeneration. And so I wanted to speak a little bit about Carl Jung. For him, the tree or botanical motifs were really central to his thinking about the kind of archetypes of the collective unconscious. And for him, the trees sort of represents the process of growth that an individual goes through in a lifetime. And its roots go down into this underworld that you described so brilliantly as this, you know, this place of decomposition. So Jung uses this alchemical term, the negredo, which is this place of decomposition. And it's really, for him in his thinking, I mean, it originally derives from alchemical thought. So it's a sort of blackening. It's a place where things kind of are boiled down to this sort of dark matter or prima materia before they can then be transmuted into the philosopher's stone, or this elixir of life, this thing which takes us into the more celestial realm, the spiritual. But importantly for Jung, that's the place where the shadow resides. So it's the place where we go to learn about ourselves on this process of self-knowledge and self-transformation. So the tree for Jung, these two illustrations are from the Red Book, which was an incredible manuscript that he made using a process of active imagination, was his terminology, where he was going into this inner realm of image in his mind to understand what are the archetypes that unite us as human beings. And as I say, the tree is really central to him, as is the mandala form, which you can see in amongst the branches of both of these trees here. So the mandala, again, is this sort of powerful, potent image, which has an alchemy of its own. You know, it's often used for meditation, to focus the mind, or to bring about kind of transformative states of consciousness. And it represents the self in a process of growth. So it's the self in the center, and then around it, the universe is kind of opening out. So I just wanted to reflect on another of your paintings in a similar context, really. So the Root Kingdom, when you spoke to me about this before, you explained how this again was sort of about this, the kind of rhizosphere, this site of, this sort of site of potential where death turns to life, but also, you know, where these things reside that we can't see. You know, there's so much richness and form beneath the surface that we just, you know, is kind of unknown to us. And to me, that really relates to this idea of the negredo, the sort of contents of our unconscious, perhaps, which are buried beneath the ground, and that at different times we allow to resurface and to be part of this fruitful process of self-knowledge.
Yes, when I was thinking about this painting, it was really the first step. I made this painting before I made Repository, but trying to think about how I could start to imagine what it felt like underground, perhaps for a root, you know, or to be part of this mycelial network of, you know, carbon and minerals and phosphorus kind of being shared or pushed, and this kind of feeling of pulsation just kind of underscored, I think, how I was trying to empathize or feel, maybe like what a root would feel. And so I started to imagine the underground maybe for these roots to be almost like a place where tubers in particular could like commingle or co-mix, like in a club or in a bathhouse, like where there's just all of this exchange going on. And so the roots themselves can become animate and therefore perhaps more graspable by humans, because I think that for a lot of people, the idea of trying to feel as a plant or know as a plant is really just a very difficult concept to start to try to wrap their heads around, because whatever their level of perception or knowledge is, it's so fundamentally different, you know, than a human-centered perspective. So I wanted to think about the intermingling, you know, and how roots might touch each other, and emphasize the shared space aspect of soil, which is a really excellent example of how interlinked all of our ecosystem is, because there aren't any boundaries. Things seep and things travel, and they really emphasize the inseparability of any one object from another, from the context around it. And it's kind of a similar thing, I feel, as maybe our dawning awareness of what it meant to breathe the same air during the pandemic, and how intimate a thing that could be. And so my thinking is soil is kind of very much this kind of shared space where bad and good things kind of flow in between, soil and root and tuber and plant, like all very easily.
Mm. And yeah, I think it's brilliant the way you sort of describe that process of trying to imagine what it would be like to be this other life form, because, you know, that's something which I think is so difficult for us, actually, and what a lot of philosophers and artists actually are spending time thinking about now is how do we kind of approach a subject on its own terms without reducing it to the limitations of our own worldview. And, you know, that can be a worldview that's determined by being human, or it can be a worldview that's determined by being in the West, where, you know, we're very dominated by a scientific or materialist point of view that then really sort of occludes these other forms of knowledge, which are, you know, more based in the spiritual or the sort of realm of the mind, you know. And one of the things that I've spent a lot of time reflecting on is, you know, the mystery of the plant kingdom, which actually sort of reveals itself to you on its own terms if you just spend time observing and, you know, sort of opening yourself out to it. Because I think what we go through is a kind of experience of recognition. So, you know, when we recognize beauty in the patterns and the forms of nature, not only in the plant kingdom, but in many ways, especially in the plant kingdom, what we're kind of appreciating is something which is also within ourselves. It's a sort of harmony that resonates with us. And that intelligence is operating through aesthetics. So it's, you know, it's not incidental that plants develop flowers and that they create fragrances and patterns that are attractive not only to us, but to birds and insects. It's actually a co-evolutionary process through which they perpetuate their own life. So I think, when we start to just be attentive to nature and to use our senses, which is why I think art is so empowering in this respect, we can really sort of start to appreciate and open out to nature and understand its intelligibility, really. So the idea of pattern and form, I think, is, it's really important in your work. It's very important to my thinking about the Botanical Kingdom and this exhibition that we mentioned previously, the Botanical Mind. And just to sort of briefly introduce some of these ideas. So these kind of mathematical principles that run throughout the universe and have expression and manifestations in the physical world, in geometry, and also in the world of art, through music. These sort of point to a kind of inner harmony or a kind of blueprint for the natural world. So I'm just illustrating here these same sort of spiral forms that occur in the vegetal, the mineral, and the animal kingdoms. And for some thinkers through time, this has been sort of described in musical terms. So the term of the music of the spheres relates this harmony in the universe, which is mathematical in principle, from all aspects of the living world, from the scale of the cosmic right down to the microscopic. And Flood, in the 17th century, he made this incredible image that we're looking at on the left-hand side here, the divine monochord, in which he imagined this as a kind of a musical string which was stretched from the sort of upper realm of the spirit down to the lower realm, again, of matter. So thinking about exactly this axis that plants seem to not only represent, but embody at the core of their being. So this inner harmony that runs through all things is also at the basis of this term, which you may have heard, as above, so below, which is a really a kind of alchemical aphorism. It's attributed to Hermes Trismegistus and the emerald tablet. But it's inspired thinkers through time, right through to the contemporary age, thinking about the relationship between the microcosm and the macrocosm, or man, or human beings and the universe. And someone that I really wanted to sort of bring into this conversation in the context of your work is Hildegard of Bingen, who was a medieval abbess. She was a polymath, really incredible for her time, her achievements for a woman. She was creating works in natural history. She composed her own music. Amongst them were the most popular medieval chants of that era. And she really was such a forward thinker that I think still resonates so much with people today. So her ideas that sort of, they encompass mysticism and science and art in this very kind of ecological vision of the planet as a living organism. So the image that I'm showing here is from an illuminated manuscript which depicts one of her visions. So she was a mystic. She believed that she had direct communion with God. And she received these visions that then were created as these beautiful mandala-like images. And she was a botanist and a healer, which is partly why I think she's so interesting in the context of this talk. And the basis of her healing philosophy was really in the idea of humors. So humorism sort of can be attributed within the European tradition anyway to ancient Greek and Roman scholars and philosophers who saw correlations between the elements of the natural world, so fire, water, air, and earth, and then the constitution of the body in what were called humors, meaning sort of saps or juices. So these being yellow bile, black bile, blood, and phlegm. So this is an idea that sort of seeks to create harmony between what's within the body, the microcosm of the body, and what's in the macrocosm of the universe, these sort of elemental principles. And this, of course, has great resonance with a much older, more ancient form of medicine from the Indian subcontinent, Ayurveda, which has 3 dosha types, Kapha, Pitta, and Vata, but the same sort of principle of harnessing these energetic properties in the natural world to bring about healing in the body. So I just sort of give that preamble before asking you to talk about this particular painting, which I absolutely loved. I was so drawn to this sort of what felt like quite a medieval form of image making. It appears like a woodcut, although hopefully you can talk a little bit more about the technique that you've used, because I know that it's not. And this figure who sort of emanates in a way from the painting is kind of an apparition, this very sort of mystical figure of the herbalist. And yeah, just for me, that really kind of evoked within me my ideas around who Hildegard of Bingen would have been, and yeah, her role as a healer and a spiritual thinker, and also a botanist.
Well, one of the things that's interesting about Hildegard is the reason she was able to know as much about the traditions in herbalism is because she gained access to those texts through the kind of because monks lent them to her. She was recognized as a brilliant polymath even in her own time, and so they allowed her. After she had demonstrated some interest in knowing plants better, they passed her the texts, including the Dioscorides and all of the other kind of primary herbals. And so she's an interesting exception to kind of a more widely spread rule that I kind of uncovered while doing research in preparation for the Physic Garden. In that I was interested specifically in what women's roles as healers would have been and how they would have gained access to the knowledge of herbalism or of healing. And as we all know, they really didn't have access to the same educational systems. And so when I was looking for documentation, I was looking for things that are no longer preserved, like they don't exist. I was looking for almost like hand-drawn manuscripts that might have been passed from a woman to a woman. And really all of that knowledge was transmitted orally. And even if there was kind of documentation, it was not preserved because it was not as interesting to bibliophiles as the herbals were. And so when I went on this trip to Italy to kind of research medieval kind of herbalist traditions, what I came to, particularly at the Giardini della Minerva, was a treasure trove of books and illuminated manuscripts that featured woodcuts and, sometimes hand-drawn illustrations like you see here. And it was at this point that I really started thinking about the print and the woodcut as a means of kind of popular transmission of knowledge, even though they might not have reached females, once you would kind of come to these printing techniques, information could be more widely shared and distributed. And so going back to the herbalist, this was an image, it was a woodcut image that I kind of found a very tiny copy of, but I really liked that it was clearly a woman and that she had kind of this apron that had all of these signs on it. And I imagine them almost to be like little pockets for different seeds or different items that she would be collecting. And so she'd almost be carrying like an encyclopedia of gathered herbs, seeds, leaves, roots with her. And the image that I was working with was very small, but I knew I wanted to blow it up and make it very big. I wanted to make her larger than life, but also something like an apparition. And so I started with a stain, as I usually do. This is always acrylic on raw canvas. And then when it came time to kind of render, the figure and the border, I had only recently started to utilize this string that I had in my studio. And as Gina, you mentioned earlier, I am a mushroom forager. I've been foraging for at least 5 years now. And through my mycophilia, I've come to learn a lot about plants as well. But when I was walking to my studio, it's in a very industrial area. And there's really just a lot of debris on the ground, including these little strips of kind of twine or string. One day I picked these up and took them to my studio, not really knowing why or having plans with them. But I found that later, by dipping them or painting them with white paint and then pressing them onto the surface of the canvas, I could get this mark that could be repeated very easily, and that felt extremely like either an engraving mark or a woodcut mark. And so it allowed me to kind of mimic this printing language while kind of keeping her as a figure, something like an apparition, like there and not there, like lost to history. And so all of that kind of came together in the herbalist.
Such a beautiful painting. And I also found this image that you shared with me so interesting, because I think, if I understand this correctly, this little kind of chart in the bottom right is something which indicates which of the humours the plant either balances, or I don't know, I'm not sure I've understood it totally correctly, but it was interesting that this sort of quite ancient form of knowledge is still being used within this contemporary botanical garden.
And this is something that was fabulous about the way that the Giardini della Minerva presented all their information, is they presented it through these multiple lenses. They presented it through the humoral tradition. They had the Latinate names, they had a QR code, so they have kind of a lot of different perspectives on how you can think about any number of the plants that are in this medicinal garden. And the garden is not specific to Italian regional traditions. Because Salerno is a port town, it has all of these doctors coming through from Turkey, from India, from Morocco, from the Middle East. All of them brought seeds, and all of them brought their knowledge base. And so it's really kind of like, for the time of like the 14th century, like a global living textbook of herbal medicine.
It's fascinating. So just reflecting a little bit again on these lost knowledges, or these kind of traditional forms of herbal lore, or botanical knowledge. Something which interests me is the relationship between these traditional or indigenous forms of knowledge and where they've gone as we've progressed, not only with scientific materialism, but with Christianity as well. So these botanical gardens, which traditionally were held within the grounds of monasteries, have a natural relationship in a way to the church. They were sites where the monastic community would cultivate plants that would then be used for healing, both for the monastic communities and for the lay communities and the local parishes that they were servicing. But they were sort of bringing this more arcane knowledge within their domain, and then kind of controlling it in a sense. But what intrigues me is how in a lot of the art that we can uncover, we can see that this sort of mysterious relationship to the plant kingdom, an almost spiritual relationship to the plant kingdom, which Hildegard of Bingen was such a great advocate of in her principle of viriditas, the greening of the earth, this healing spiritual potential that we all have also within ourselves. And this comes through in sort of other documents and paintings in churches. And this Psalter, which I'm just sharing a very small detail of, it's a very sort of pixelated image, unfortunately, but it shows Christ amongst these very strange kind of mushroom-like forms. And, you know, if we think back to the book of Genesis in the Bible, the significance of the tree of knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life, you know, shouldn't be underestimated, I don't think. You know, right there at the very beginning of time, the human being, the sort of human condition is situated with these two vegetal forms. And they seem to have, you know, a great significance to the development of our spirituality, our self-knowledge, and our consciousness. And I just wanted to talk about this other really intriguing document, which is again extremely mysterious, the Voynich manuscript, which has now been dated to the 15th century. It's in the Yale University Collection, but it's full of these not only botanical images, but astrological and cosmological images as well. And it seems to speak, although the language in it has still not been deciphered. It's written in this encrypted code. No one knows exactly what it says, but even without the words, the images alone speak so powerfully, I think, to this kind of cosmic significance of the plant kingdom. So what we're looking at here is a sort of astrological diagram, really, but it's full of these plant-like forms that could be kind of flowers opening out, or they could equally be the arrangement of different star patterns in the galaxy. And this is just another opening of the book. So we were lucky enough to have a facsimile copy of it in the exhibition. And this was also really intriguing to me, these images of plants which were sort of transforming into animal forms. And some of the most extraordinary images are these that show female forms moving through the vascular networks of plants or being born out of the seed pods of plants. And to me, this really speaks to the sort of fecundity of the vegetal kingdom and its you know, often allegorical connection with the divine feminine. And with the female form as not just a place of nourishment and shelter, but of this sort of generative life force. So again, I think there's this very sort of close relationship to female knowledge that is in, you know, for different reasons through time, lost to us.
Can I jump in here for just a second? There's a quote that you wrote in the Botanical Mind catalog that resonates so much for me. And it's kind of the way that I understand how women folk healers would have operated, which is these pre-Renaissance herbalism and pharmacological methods of healing came from what you call the natural lived science based on intimate lived experience in nature. And it's also a knowledge base that overlapped with alchemy. And so there's kind of definitely both like a hidden knowledge, but like a knowledge that comes from the physical interaction with the world and then connecting that, you know, up and down.
Yeah. I mean, I think that it's so interesting you remind me of that because you know, the rational is of course important in the study of nature and, you know, particularly with scientific rationalism, but the sort of felt lived experience is no less important. And I'll talk about this a little bit later when we talk about Goethe's ideas. But, you know, as I was describing earlier, this sort of opening out to a subject on its own terms, I think is something which, you know, has been important to the development of our understanding of the natural world, and that we've kind of lost in a way by this overemphasis on a form of empiricism which is very materialistic. So, you know, there's also a soft empiricism which is felt through the lived experience of the body, through aesthetics, through music, through the way that nature actually sings to us and speaks to us and reveals itself. And, you know, a lot of that thinking is really central to the way that indigenous cultures understand not only the worlds around them, but their place within it also, that they're a part of a living environment that has a natural harmony. And, you know, to sort of feel that and be part of its rhythm is a much more sustainable way of existing. And I think that thinking is also there, very present in Hildegard of Bingham, her writing, her images, this one in particular, Cultivating the Cosmic Tree, which, you know, again, we see this sort of motif of the vegetal as such a primary elemental force, which underpins all of life. So another of Hildegard's images, quite different, is this one, which I would like to invite you to talk about. So the image that we're looking at has this dung monster creature in the bottom right-hand corner, which then features in one of your paintings, which I'll move on to now. So, I mean, that image to me was extremely intriguing, partly because of my research into Jung and his ideas around the shadow. And in some of the research that I've done into Hildegard's work, there are suggestions that also very present in her thinking was a confrontation with the shadow and these sort of creatures from the underworld. So for me, this really speaks to that presence in her work. But I was hoping that you could sort of open out some of your own relationship and how it appears in this painting.
Sure. This painting feels so oddly tame, like coming after her illustration, which I love. And so the dung monster, which in her cosmology, you know, she, I think, interpreted as a very, both male because of the phallic presentation, but also like aligned with the devil or the Antichrist. And the dung monster, that's part of a literal translation that came from a book that I had, but just because I was thinking about compost a lot, like in my cosmology, a dung monster would be a god of transformation, and therefore like definitely have a part to play in the physic garden that I wanted to create, because I needed, even though this scene was above ground, I wanted something that would still indicate that kind of shadow below ground process that I was thinking about in other paintings. And so this painting, The Physic Garden, is really quite large. And I'm so happy that you kind of paired these words, the soft empiricism, because it's very much the way that I was thinking about seeing within the Physic Garden. In the practice of foraging, when I'm looking for something very specific, there's a kind of vision that I use, and it's very, it feels very primal. It's a kind of scan, like it's very soft eyes, loose vision in which I'm looking for a particular color, a particular shape, a particular texture. And then once I see it, my eyes kind of lock in. And then I start to flip into the analytical rational, you know, does this conform with what I know is in season, what grows in my region? Does this have all of the identifying characteristics that I would use to confirm what I think this is? And so when painting the Physic Garden, and every plant in here is like an herbal medicinal. There's comfrey, there's nettles, there's poppy, there's oats, ginkgo, licorice. But I kind of wanted to create a similar viewing experience for someone looking at the painting to what I was experiencing when I'm foraging for things outside.
So beautiful. And, you know, to me, it just feels so teeming with life, this image,
Yes.
and that sort of magic that you can really feel when you're in a sort of natural environment like that. So just sort of carrying on from thinking about this way in which we can observe pattern and allow forms to sort of speak to us, I wanted to talk a little bit about Goethe's ideas. So Goethe, as I'm sure everyone knows, was an 18th century polymath, a poet, a writer, but also a scientific thinker. And he wrote a book called The Metamorphosis of Plants, which was hugely influential. But the reason that I'm so drawn to Goethe is that he advocated for a practice of study of the natural world that combined not only the rational and sort of thinking and observing what's in front of us, but also the imagination. So thinking that bringing our senses and our sort of inner world into contact, almost in a kind of phenomenological encounter with the natural world, was really central to his thinking. So Goethe had this idea, which he called the Erbpflanz, so the plant, which is a kind of primordial plant being. What he was intrigued by was the inner force or the inner being of the plant, what drives it to create the forms that make it. So, you know, if we look at the vegetal kingdom, we can see such an array of different morphologies, you know, the different leaves, the different sort of structures of trees, the flowers. And his sort of inquiry was, well, you know, what is it that's driving a plant to take on the form that it has? And he believed that it had a kind of primary unit, which then was replicated and kind of mutated over time. And he came to the conclusion, which, you know, is now sort of discredited, but that the leaf was this primary unit. So even the flower, the petals that construct a flower, was a kind of mutated leaf in a way. So as I say, that, you know, these ideas no longer really hold within scientific understanding, but I think what's so important about Goethe is this process of imaginative inquiry, to sort of understand these vital internal forces which give rise to form. And the reason I mention that in the context of this talk is because of some earlier work that you made, where you were constructing plant forms that were kind of imaginative, I think. They were taking sort of these basic plant-like forms and you were constructing imaginary composites. So I just wanted to introduce these two images and ask you to speak a little bit about that process and perhaps how it's progressed now into this more recent work.
Yeah, that kind of idea of imaginative inquiry definitely shaped the way that I started kind of questioning myself in this series. Do these plants need to be real? You know, or can they be kind of synthesized or imagined? So both of these paintings came from an earlier show that I had at Ostia Geisberg Gallery called Casa della Nuova Strega, or House of the New Witch, where I was trying to imagine what kind of objects or processes or rituals a new witch, and I use that term very broadly. I am not a witch, but I'm interested in ritual and healing and charged objects and herbalism and things like that. So I used it as an umbrella term. What kind of things she would have around her. And so in some of the paintings like Scythe, I kind of made this shape that has maybe almost, it's not based on a real plant. And I wanted it something to have like sharp leaves, or leaves almost like claws, you know, to be almost a return of some kind of, you know, the underground, the darkness, the shadow plant, the shadow side, that kind of acted almost as a marker. Before you could even get into the rest of the space of the painting, you had to move past this, you know, kind of sickle-like plant. And then these kind of themes of darkness or death are reiterated even amongst the kind of very light patterning with the sculpture that I painted on the side, which is almost, it's a saddle jug that's kind of a figure of death, arm in arm with a child, you know. So I think in this painting in particular, I was interested in kind of like, even amongst joy and light, a kind of feeling of foreboding or acknowledgement of death. And then on the right, this is a bit more specific a translation, or thinking, what would a new witch have on her workbench? You know, so she has something actual, like a bundle of sage leaves to protect She has masking tape to tape things together, to conjoin things. She has a fermenting crock. She has mixing bowls to combine, scissors to cut, a knife to forage with, and she needs a wand. And so she has kind of a wooden wand that has like a mushroom kind of strapped to the top. And then all of this kind of gives birth to this imagined shape that is botanical, but it's also like a flame and also like a wing. And this is a shape that came directly from an alchemical engraving. And I liked the multiplicity of things that shape could kind of reference at the same time. So it's a union of all of those things.
Incredible. So I wanted to move on to some images so that we can think a bit about an idea that I found so intriguing that you introduced to me about considering whether or not a painting can be a kind of recipe, or whether it can be like a spell, or whether it can sort of function and be active and do something. So I think you mentioned this to me in the context of this particular painting, but perhaps you can also introduce that that inquiry in your thinking.
Absolutely. That question. Oh, okay.
Sorry, ladies. I just wanted to interrupt and let you guys know, 5-minute warning.
Okay. Thank you. The question of what is the potential for transformation, both in ecology and in our bodies through plants and medicine, motivated a lot of the research. The question of how can an image act, or what can an image do, motivated the paintings. And so because I was looking at a lot of instructional texts, I'm very drawn to almost like diagrammatic illustrations. If you do this and then that, you'll get this. And there's a very straightforward and pragmatic nature to it. But I'm trying to describe things that are completely ineffable, you know? So it's this tension of like, how do you do this thing? Well, it's mystical and complicated. And so both of those can kind of come through these multiple languages of the kind of woodcut, engraving, the printing, and the kind of combination of the more affective stain space with this kind of distilling process, which is what's actually being described here. So yeah.
And I also included this slide because I loved the way you described these to me, that these were confections. So they were kind of like these little, if you could imagine that you'd somehow distilled the essence of these different plant substances somehow. So again, I was sort of thinking of these as in a way like kind of like medicines, you know, that you could prescribe each one for a different condition. And just to show again some images from the Voynich manuscript in this context, the Voynich manuscript has at the back section pages upon pages that are actually recipes. So I thought that was particularly interesting, thinking about how, you know, these ancient sort of mystical documents can be quite instructive. But the thing that really interested me when you put that proposition forth was to think about the potency of images themselves and how they can convey more than the spoken word or the written word, and that they can actually be these active devices. And nowhere is that more true than within alchemy. You know, it's a sort of discipline which really speaks through its images. And I'm just sharing too here that I won't talk about in any depth at all because we don't have time, but just to show the significance of the serpent within alchemical thought. So the serpent being this creature which is often associated with transformation. It sheds its skin, so it's associated also with everlasting life. And here on the left-hand side, it's a creature which is for Kircher, signifying this sort of vital life force that moves down through the 9 spheres and then opens out with 3 heads at the base, which are the 3 aspects of space and time. But I wanted to show those and then ask you about this painting in which you also have chosen to depict the serpent, and ask you about the meaning of this for you.
Sure. This is actually a work on paper that was in another previous solo show called Herbal Lore at Crystal Flowers NYC. And I was researching specifically Southern Italian folk remedies, and a lot of them included the need of a four-lined snake. And so I started researching that, and apparently around Abruzzo, there's a tradition of celebration of the snakes called cervone, that are venerated yearly in this small town, and they're both worshipped and feared for protection and for, they aren't actually poisonous, but I think they stand in, for a lot of biblical references. And so in mine, I kind of wanted to create the snake that was standing up of its own accord and create something that was almost similar to Aeschylus's rod, that a snake would be wrapped around. So calling back into really kind of primary images of snakes, but kind of put it in this impossible Western linear perspective space, So again, I'm trying to kind of, it's an uneasy kind of conflation of these kind of pre-Renaissance ideas and techniques within a rational kind of format of thinking.
Well, maybe that's a good place to finish. I mean, there was a lot more that I was hoping we'd cover, but I think we've probably run out of time. So if we want to save a little bit of time for any questions, perhaps we should stop there.
Yeah, we have a question from Pamela Casper, who's asking, have you read Suzanne Simard's new book, Finding the Mother Tree? If you have, do you see her observational findings in keeping with your approach? She is finding the physical basis for what we artists and Indigenous peoples have known intuitively.
So, I don't know if Gina has, I have not. I am absolutely interested in Suzanne Simard, who is one of the first, possibly the first scientists to definitively prove that trees shared nutrients kind of underground between kind of both offspring trees and nearby trees. And so essentially she proved, and correct me, Pamela, if I'm wrong, but she proved kind of that trees, and by implication a lot of growth, was not actually operating under a kind of survival of the fittest model, but more as a marketplace or somewhat communal or collaborative model. So I would definitely enjoy reading her new book, and I will take that down and take your suggestion to do that.
So the rest are kind of comments. I can forward them to panelists after the talk. Just for sake of time, I'm not sure if we can answer them during the Zoom. They're not really questions, but I'll forward them to you afterwards.
Okay, great. Okay, well, this has been so engaging. Thank you both. Gina, you have just incredible illuminating presentation. I really enjoyed it. And of course, Angelina, thank you for sharing your work with us. There's always something new to say about your work, and I enjoy listening to it. And of course, for the audience, thank you for your time joining us. And you can look through Angelina's exhibition on our website and her previous exhibitions as well that she mentioned. And yeah, please, thank you so much for joining us, and have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.